All right, now we're going to try to go through the rest of the structures in this lab. There's a small bone that looks like a letter U called the hyoid bone. This bone is found underneath your chin. It's the only bone in the body that has no articulation with any other bone. And if they found this bone to be broken in an autopsy, they would think that probably someone got choked to death. So it's kind of an interesting little fact about the hyoid bone. All right, now we have the anterior part of the rib cage. Excuse me, here we go. And this bone right here, that is your chest bone, this is called the sternum, and it has different parts. The top part is called the manubrium, this part right here. The middle is called the body, and then there's a little pointy part here at the bottom called the xiphoid process. And then all of these connect to ribs, and that cartilage is called costal cartilage. Costal means ribs. We're now on page 78. We need to talk about the classification of ribs. Ribs are numbered superior to inferior. So the very first rib is closest. It's kind of hiding underneath this clavicle. The very first rib is just called rib 1. And those first 7 ribs are called true ribs. So the way you'd answer this on the test, if I pointed to the first rib or I put a star on it and said, what rib is it? You would have to say true rib 1. All right? And then as we got to rib 8, ribs 8, 9, and 10, actually all the rest of the ribs are called false ribs. The last 2 we can't see real well here, but they don't have any costal cartilage. And the last 2, ribs 11 and 12, are called floating ribs. But I'll accept false ribs for all of these. And the difference between a true rib and a false rib is that true ribs have their own direct costal cartilage connection to the sternum. And all the false ribs, if they have a connection, they connect up through some other costal cartilage, or they don't have a connection at all. Those are those floating ribs. So there's 12 ribs total, 1 to 12, and you need to say either true rib or false rib. And if you want to memorize these other names, you can. On the rib bone, you know, it looks like a rib bone. I think it's a very easy structure to identify, but at the end there is an articulation, and it kind of protrudes out, and that is called the head. This part is called the neck, which makes sense. Then it protrudes out again. That's called the tubercle. We've seen that word before. This is the tubercle of the rib. This whole thing right here is the body of the rib, and then we're going to see in lab that there's a little indentation line here, and that's called the costal groove. Those are the parts of the rib. All right, we're going to go through a general vertebrae, and then I'm going to kind of quickly go through some of the parts that are unique to different types of vertebrae. So in general, this is a vertebra, and you can see I started marking things up all over the place. So I want you to kind of do this along with me, okay? And I'll outline these right here. This is the posterior side, so I wrote P-O-S-T. If you run your fingers down your back, you'll feel this sticking out, okay? That bump is called the spinous process. So right posterior, and then just this little bump sticking out the backside of every vertebra is called the spinous process. And then the anterior part of the vertebra is always called the body of the vertebra. So you might want to write anterior, posterior, and then outline the body of the vertebra and just kind of give a little outline to the spinous process. All right. Now, there's an opening for the spinal cord in each vertebra, and that opening for the spinal cord is called the vertebral foramen. That makes sense. It's in the vertebrae, and it's an opening. We know a foramen is an opening. And then there is a point that sticks out to the side. And this part that sticks out laterally, I outlined it right here. There's two of them though. That part that sticks out laterally is called the transverse process. Now on this view, we can't see that there are two little parts kind of sticking down inferiorly, but I highlighted it right here. And that inferior little protrusion is called the inferior articular process. And then there's a flat spot right here called the superior articular process. And those two articulate with each other. Finally, we have two parts of just a general vertebrae. The part that is kind of the bridge closest to the body of the vertebrae, I highlighted it here and here. That part that is closest to the body of the vertebrae, that bridge, is called the pedicle. And the part that goes kind of in between the transverse and the spinous process, right here, is called the lamina. All right? And that whole thing together is called the vertebral arch. Now, the first 7 vertebrae are called cervical vertebrae. So page 81, we start looking at cervical vertebrae. And this is how you label vertebrae. C1 is the one closest to the head. C2 would be the next inferior. They go 1 to 7, kind of top to bottom if our person is standing in anatomical position. Okay. So something, you see that the cervical vertebrae looks a little bit different. Something really unique about cervical vertebrae that none of the other types of vertebrae, they have these little openings here for the vertebral artery. And those openings have their own name, and those are called transverse foramen. This is still called the vertebral foramen. So there's 2 transverse foramen and 1 vertebral foramen. And the thoracic and lumbar vertebrae do not have these transverse foramen. That's an artery that goes up through the cervical vertebrae and into the brain and provides the brain with blood, just like the carotid artery. All right, so you can see that on the cervical vertebrae, it's real thin, and the spinous process kind of sticks out this way. And we can see the superior articular process here, and underneath, we can see the, and we can also see the transverse process here. We can't get a good view of the inferior articular process on the cervical vertebrae. Now there's 2 unique cervical vertebrae. The first 2 have their own name, and I want you to be able to write these down on the exam. The first one is called the atlas, because it holds up the whole world. And the second one has this little kind of finger-like projection that the atlas rotates on. This is what allows you to shake your head no, okay, and start that movement. The second cervical vertebrae is called the axis because the atlas rotates around this axis. And so you need to be able to identify these 2 vertebrae as the atlas, and the atlas is also called C1. This is the second cervical vertebrae. That's called the axis. You can recognize it by this little protrusion sticking up. It looks like a finger. And the second cervical vertebrae is called the axis, and it's also called C2.